Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's session at Orkney Aviation Festival. We're thrilled to have you all joining us via YouTube. It's going to be an exciting and informative session, so be sure to keep those questions coming as we'll be taking questions from YouTube throughout the talk. Today, we're honoured to have a very special guest, retired Commander David Hobbs, MBE. David is no stranger to Orkney or this festival, having participated in several events with another Orkney production, AOP, and the Orkney Aviation Festival over the years. He first visited Orkney back in 2007, where he delivered a fascinating talk on Squadron Commander Dunning, who is the first pilot to land an aircraft successfully on a moving ship. Since then, David has generously shared his vast knowledge of naval and aviation history with vast audiences, making him a beloved figure in both the aviation and military history communities. David served in the Royal Navy as a pilot for an impressive 33 years and later became the curator of the Fleet Air Arm Museum, a role he held for 8 years. Since then, he's established himself as one of the leading experts on naval aviation, with over 20 highly regarded books to his name. His latest work, The Fleet Air Arm and the War in Europe, 1939 to 1945, published in 2022, adds to his extensive collection of research and insights on the topic. Today's session will focus on the vital but often overlooked role of the Fleet Requirements Unit, or FRU. This unit was involved in various crucial tasks during World War II, such as towing targets for gunnery practice in Orkney. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Commander David Hobbs. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here yet again. And what I'm going to do, as Kat mentioned, was talk about the vital role of fleet requirements aircraft operating from Tern, HMS Tern. Next slide, please. Just so that we're sure where it is and what we're talking about, the red light now will show where the airfield is on the Orkney mainland near Loch Isbister. Next slide, please. It's a drawing, and it shows you that it's an unusually large airfield. Typically, for a naval air station, it has 4 runways. You can see all the black rectangles around, which are squadron hangars and dispersals. There was space for disembarked fighter and torpedo bomber squadrons, as well as the major fleet requirements unit, 771 Squadron, that supported the home fleet. You can see the runways are pretty much the standard size for a naval air station. That's 1,000 yards long and only 30 feet wide. They're much smaller than the runways built for the RAF because the Admiralty wanted people to get used to operating in a confined space. As when they embarked in an aircraft carrier, they wouldn't have the luxury of a lot of space to taxi and move around in. Next slide, please. Taken from the height that the drawing showed, this shows you an aerial view of Twat as it was in late 1944. It first started operating aircraft in the middle of 1941 when the runways were completed, and it opened as a commissioned ship in the Royal Navy, HMS Tern, at the beginning of 1942. It ceased active flying at the end of 1945, but spent another 10 years in care and maintenance, maintained by the Royal Navy in case there was a war and a need for bases to open up again. 771 Squadron was one of the largest in the Royal Navy. It operated a number of different types of aircraft. Where did these come from? Well, before the war, aircraft were used on fleet requirements tasks that were broadly obsolescent. When they were replaced in frontline squadrons, they were used to tow targets or carry out simulated attacks on ships so that gunners could practice their skills. Those of you who've ever had a go at clay pigeon shooting or even shooting at anything else with a shotgun will realize you can't just pick up a gun and shoot at a moving object with any hope of successfully hitting it. You have to practice and practice hard. And that's exactly the same with the gunnery systems in ships. You can't just man a gun on the occasion you need it and fire away hoping to hit something. From the beginning of the Second World War, increasingly sophisticated fire control systems were fitted in Royal Navy warships. Directors that would acquire the target either visually or later using radar and provide information for the guns to point at the target, but aim off sufficiently for the shell to be in the right place in its time of flight to intercept the aircraft as it moved either left or right or towards the target. So constant practice was required so that ships' gunnery systems were on the ball if they were going to have any chance against enemy aircraft. Where did the aircraft come from during the war? A variety of things. To start with, some aircraft were bought from America on tick to see if they were any good to add to British production. Some of them were good, some of them weren't. Next slide, please. This is a Martin Maryland, designed as a twin-engine bomber, bought by the French. When the French collapsed in 1940, part of the order was taken over by the RAF that wasn't particularly pleased with it as a bomber, and it made some available for use by the Royal Navy as target towing aircraft. This is one of two that was operated by 771 Squadron. It's actually photographed at Paxton, and you may recognize the two hangars. Those hangars aren't there anymore, but concrete structures are there in the same place. And if you walk around the old airfield, you can stand on the exact spot where the cameraman was. This aircraft was actually quite famous. During the hunt for the Bismarck, it was known that she'd sailed from Germany and was thought that she was in Bergen. Bad weather clamped the North Sea, and RAF Coastal Command said the weather was too bad for its aircraft to fly across the North Sea to Bergen to look for it. The Home Fleet desperately needed to know if she'd sailed, and so the commanding officer of Hatston came up with the idea of using one of his fleet requirements aircraft, this Maryland, flown by the senior pilot of 771, Lieutenant Commander Goddard, with Commander Hank Rotherham as his observer, to fly through the bad weather across the North Sea and search Bergen for the Bismarck. Shortly after this, Goddard was promoted to captain and became captain of HMS Tern, so he has quite a connection both with the squadron and the place. Despite the bad weather, they flew across the North Sea at extremely low level. They flew into Bergen Fjord, searched it extensively, found that the Bismarck had sailed, flew out again under fire from the Germans, and were able to send the vital message to the Home Fleet that the Bismarck had sailed. So although this was very much a second-line aircraft and a second-line role, it actually fulfilled one of the most important operational missions of the early part of the Second World War. Next slide, please. Another of the aircraft that the Royal Navy got via the French was this. It's a Vought Sikorsky Chesapeake. The French Navy bought them, a lot of them, in 1939, but they weren't ready by 1940 when the French collapsed. The Royal Navy took over the order and initially thought of using them for convoy protection from small aircraft carriers. They put a lot more equipment in than the French had, which caused the performance to deteriorate. So it did equip a frontline squadron, proved a bit of a failure, and so they were issued to second-line squadrons like 771. They had the advantage that they could carry a fair load, they could stay airborne for a fair amount of time, but not move very quickly. Next, please. The aircraft that were retired by the Air Force as they got better ones were another source of target aircraft for the Fleet Air Arm. This is a Bristol Blenheim flying over the Orkney coast. You can see it comes from Thwart because of its side letters. If you look aft of the roundel or to the left of the roundel, you see the letter T, that's Thwart, 8 indicates the squadron, and J is the individual aircraft. So all the aircraft in 771 would have had similar markings. These were relatively fast aircraft, and they were used to simulate German bombers attacking the fleet in a variety of ways, which I'll explain later on. Next, please. Two more 771 aircraft. You can see here the T8, that shows it's 771 Squadron, and their individual aircraft B and E. The Nero one, these are both American aircraft bought by the British Purchasing Commission in 1940, taken on by the Air Force, and didn't do that well in the Air Force, and so they were made available for target duties with the Fleet Air Arm. The Nero one is a Douglas Boston. It's a medium bomber, twin engine bomb bay, could carry about a ton of bombs a reasonable distance. Some of them were converted in the RAF, though. In 1940, there was a desperate short of night fighters. So they came up with the idea of twinning a light bomber like the Boston with a single-seat fighter. And the bomber had a whacking great searchlight put in its nose, and you can see there's a flat plate. The searchlight's actually been removed, and the plate's there, but flying in the night fighter role, the searchlight would have been used to drone around the skies over southern England looking for enemy aircraft. When illuminated by the searchlight, the single-seat fighter was supposed to move in and shoot it down. The whole idea didn't work very well. It was a bit of a flop, and the aircraft were made available to the Fleet Air Arm. The modified aircraft with searchlight was known as the Boston Havoc, a rather exciting name for a rather dull aeroplane. Next, please. This is one of the Navy's own former frontline aircraft. It's a Blackburn Rock. It was built as a turret fighter. So where you see the telegraphist air gunner standing up at the rear part of the cockpit, there would have been a power-operated gun turret with 4 Vickers machine guns. It was underpowered, slowed by the weight and drag of the turret, and was desperately slow for a fighter. They were used briefly during the Norwegian campaign, flying from the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. Didn't do very well, and almost immediately they were taken to Naval Air Yards. The turret was removed, and they were modified for use as target tugs. 771 got quite a few, and they operated until 1943, when spares began to run out, and they were scrapped. This one's photographed from another rock. Next, please. This is a Blackburn Rock, and you can see it's beginning to deploy a sleeve target astern. In the after part of the cockpit, you can see the towing winch. It was operated by a telegraphist air gunner, so the crew would have been a pilot and a tag. The actual cable is coming out from the lower part of the fuselage, and you can see at the beginning there's a little notch in the fuselage. That was a guillotine. If something went wrong and the sleeves target started tumbling, the pilot could guillotine it and get rid of it. There was 6,000 feet of cable, which equates to about a mile, 2,000 yards. So the sleeve target was towed about a mile astern of the aircraft. It had quite a drag, as you might imagine, pulling that load along. So whereas the aircraft was capable of about 200 knots without a target, its speed was reduced to about 160 with it, and the pilot would have to fly with pretty much full power on for the whole flight. If he tried a turn or anything that would increase the drag even more, it would bring the speed back near the stall, and quite often they would fly with a little bit of flap selected down to increase the wing lift, make the aircraft more maneuverable. Because full power had to be kept on for such a long time, engine life was quite short, and it wasn't a very popular role with pilots, because chugging along in a straight line with your engine straining away didn't give you much opportunity to maneuver or throw the aircraft around. Next, please. As the war went on, the need for specialized target tug and fleet requirements aircraft increased dramatically. So whereas a few dozen retired bombers or old aircraft that hadn't cut the mustard in the front line were adequate to start with, hundreds of target towing aircraft were required by the mid-war period, and a lot of these were achieved by the Miles company, which converted its master trainer into a specialist target tug. So this is a Miles Martinet, the result. You can see 771 Squadron T8 and its aircraft K. You can see it's got a sleeve target deployed. If you look, you can just make out the cable, the towing cable, and you can see the guillotine rather more clearly. And you can see that the pilot has actually got flap deployed to increase lift. So he's droning along over the fleet with the ships shooting at him. Okay, next, please. This is another martinet. It's got a sleeve target at short stay, and it's actually running in to drop the target ashore that's coming in off the sea. The pilot could release it, it would flutter to the ground, and weapon analysts could look at it and see how many bullet holes there were in it, how effective the shooting was. For air-to-air firings, and if you look carefully, you might just see there are 3 bullet holes in it that we can make out, maybe more on the other side. For light weapons, such as fighter, cannon, or machine guns, and the guns that you'd have on a ship like an Oerlikon, what they did was dip the bullets into paint so that there were different coloured bullets fired at the target. Prominent colours, red, green, brown, blue, yellow, so that when the sleeve was brought back, different ships or aircraft might have fired at it, and the analysts would be able to see how many each one of them had hit. There would be a little ring of paint marking around each one of the hits. Again, you can see that the martinet has got flap deployed. Next, please. This was taken at Twat, and it shows not only that the airfield operated the more elderly, less high performance combat types, it could also operate fighters, both disembarked fighter squadrons and war-weary, for the want of a better word, ones like these. These are actually aircraft of 771 Squadron. They're Chancefort Corsairs, probably the most powerful and most successful naval fighter of the war. Capable of speed of nearly 400 miles an hour, big single engine. The propeller, you can see, is 13'6" in diameter, and the crank wing was to make sure, or to ensure, that you didn't need a oleo undercarriage of too great a length when operating from a carrier, but still keep the propeller well clear of the deck. These were used to simulate fighter attacks on warships and high-speed maneuvering. So they didn't actually tow targets, they acted as a target themselves. So they weren't there for live firing exercise, but they did give ships the chance to use their direction systems and fire control systems, and for the guns to follow, even though they didn't actually shoot at them. Next, please. And this was taken, it shows a number of Corsairs taken off. What they're going to do is carry out a set-piece training attack on ships of the home fleet. This is the formation they would use to fly out towards the fleet from Tern. They would break up into individual groups and attack from different directions, high and low level, in order to confuse the defending system. Next, please. And this is one of the most sophisticated targets carried by aircraft from Tern. Again, this is taken at Tern. It's a 32-foot towed glider. So instead of towing a sleeve or banner target, the aircraft would tow one of these. It would offer slightly less resistance and less drag, but on the other hand, it would be a bit complicated and could be difficult if gunfire shot away part of one of its wings, for instance. It would tumble and put a pretty big strain on the towing wire, so the pilot would have to guillotine it quite quickly. They were made in large numbers. This one's actually taken at Tern, but used by the Royal Navy around the world. Gliders just like this one were used by fleet requirements units in the south of England, in Malta, Egypt, from Deucalion, Ceylon, and in Australia. And interestingly enough, one has just been found in Australia recently, and the Mooramin Air Museum just outside Melbourne has got one. They've been asking questions about it. It was left behind by the Royal Navy in 1945, and it's just been found, and they're hoping to make a museum exhibit out of it. Next, please. This is a 32-foot winged glider in flight. You can see it's got white stripes and roundels on it to make it a bit more conspicuous. The towing wire attached to a notch, you might just be able to see it in the top of the fuselage, just above the wing, and the V shape you can see on the nose was to make sure that the wire stayed within constrained limits, keeping the aircraft straight while it's flying along. You can see it's got Royal Navy painted on the tailplane, and you can see it's got a wheeled undercarriage. There was actually a smaller version, the 16-foot towed glider that was used by the Royal Navy, but I haven't got a photograph of one of those. Next, please. This is actually a post-war photograph. It shows an aircraft called a Short Sturgeon, which wasn't actually operated at Tern, but it's towing a 32-foot glider. The aircraft would have taken off with the glider behind it on the runway, and it would have taken off with it at what was called short stay. You can just make out the towing wire here. Once it was safely airborne and climbed to height, it would gradually be reeled out until it was 6,000 yards astern of the 6,000 feet astern of the Sturgeon. The Sturgeon was originally designed as a medium bomber for use from aircraft carriers, but the war ended before it came into service, and they were modified for use specifically as target towing aircraft. It had high speed, folding wings from its earlier design for carrier operation, but you can see the funny great nose with a glass section on it that housed a camera that was used to film target triggered bursts in throw-off shoots, about which I'll say more in a moment. Next, please. Not all the aircraft were fixed wing, and Tern was one of the first Fleet Air Arm bases to operate helicopters. This is a Sikorsky Hoverfly, operated by the Royal Navy. They were provided by the Americans under Lend-Lease arrangements. Had a small Franklin engine, which you can see behind the pilot's seat. The pilot is Winkle Brown, of whom you may have heard, who flew both fixed and rotary wing aircraft. And what he's demonstrating here is that the aircraft could be trimmed out to hover perfectly on its own. There was a lot of doubt earlier on because the controls were rather difficult, and fixed-wing pilots weren't used to the difference, that it was quite a difficult thing to hover. He's showing that if you trimmed it out properly, it would hover perfectly acceptably. Another photograph taken in the same sequence, they brought out a step ladder, put it next to the helicopter, and a naffy girl climbed up it and gave him a cup of tea, just to show how safe helicopters were. Health and safety didn't appear to have existed in 1945 when this was taken. Next. This is another of the ex-RAF aircraft. It was a fighter, the Bolton Paul Defiant. It was a turret fighter, like the Royal Navy's Blackburn Rock, but it too was something of a failure. Didn't work at all well. It had a Rolls-Royce engine, Merlin engine, and could operate at high speed. So it had been ordered into massive production numbers early in the war. And before they were all cancelled, the RAF found itself with about 1,000 of these and not much of a role for them. So they were nearly all converted into target tugs, and a number of them were passed on to the Royal Navy and used throughout the world, Malta, Ceylon, and Australia, they were all squadrons similar to 771 in the fleet requirements role, operating Defiance. Next, please. And until 1943, 771 Squadron retained a couple of these. It's a Gloucester Sea Gladiator, the last biplane fighter in Fleet Air Arm Service. The stated reason for keeping it is it was quite a highly maneuverable aircraft, and it could be used to simulate attacks on ships. It probably wasn't any better than a lot of the other fighters, certainly not the Corsair, but as a biplane, it was very maneuverable, and it was kept because pilots actually liked flying it. Two reasons. One, they could say they'd actually flown a biplane, and two, it was a joy to carry out aerobatics in it. This is one of the last in naval service. Next, please. So what I want to do now is talk to you about the various ways the aircraft were used to simulate attacks. This is the cruiser Swift Shore at sea off Orkney, and I've drawn this up. Think of it as a whiteboard on which I'm explaining things to you to show what was meant by a throw-off shoot. So at the after end of the bridge, you can see there's the director control tower. Had both radar and telescopes and could track targets with radar and visually. Once an aircraft was seen closing on the ship, the director would point towards it and send information down to the transmitting station, which is down low in the ship under armour. The information would be passed to the turrets. So if you look forward, that's B turret with 3 6-inch guns, and they would follow the director to point at the target. However, for the purposes of a throw-off shoot, the throw-off switch would be made, which would point the barrels 15 degrees away from the direction indicated by the director. This means that everybody in the ship could practice firing. Ammunition, live ammunition, would be provided from the magazines up to the turrets and loaded into the guns and fired at the sort of rate they would fire at an enemy aircraft. In theory, the attacking aircraft was quite safe because all the shells would burst 15 degrees off the heading of the aircraft. So the ship got all the benefit of an attack without endangering the aircraft. As you can imagine, if you were a Fleet Requirements Unit pilot, this was the least popular target attack profile. You can imagine that pilots would ask several times to confirm that the throw-off switch was in the right position, but even having done so, there were mistakes, and some ships did actually open fire without it. There were also, I have to say, to be fair, some instances where fire was opened on enemy aircraft with the throw-off position made, but that was something you could rapidly put right. So throw-off ships were popular with the ships because they gave everybody the chance to practice what they did. Similar techniques would have been used at Yesnaby, which is a firing range on the north shore of Orkney mainland, where the Fleet Requirements Unit again towed targets around for people to shoot light weapons such as Oerlikons and Bofors at. Next, please. The two other types of shoot I want to illustrate are the standard towed target for a surface-to-air shoot. You've got the ship at the bottom, the 6,000 feet of cable towed out, and in this instance, a sleeve target there. So the beauty of this is the aircraft, the towing aircraft, is much safer. It actually flies over the firing ship before it acquires the sleeve and opens fire on it. So all the gunfire is actually going away from the towing aircraft. You can see there are obvious limitations. The towing aircraft would have to make sure it's got the height of the sleeve right. You would want it to be well above the firing ship, because if it was low, it might actually hit one of the ship's masts or get tangled with it. You've got the other thing too that you want to be wary of, ready to guillotine at a moment's notice. If a hit ripped away part of the sleeve, it might tumble. And in tumbling, it might go close to the surface. So you'd want to get rid of it before it overflew the ship. Possibly the most interesting type of chute, though, is air-to-air, which again, fleet requirements units would have to take part in. You've got the towing aircraft over on the right, again with cable out, sleeve target. And the aircraft coming out to attack the sleeve would fly up on its left-hand side about 1,500 feet higher than the sleeve. Sometimes for a chute of this sort, up to 4 aircraft would come out and they would all form a pattern, one after the other, flying around to have a go at the sleeve. In this instance, I've just shown one so that you get the idea of what happened. When the pilot of the towing aircraft, who controlled the whole exercise, said, "Okay, you're clear in live," or clear in hot would be the terminology he would use, the attacking aircraft would bank to the right and begin to dive. This simulates a real attack on a bomber known as the perch, where you would be turning towards it and moving in both elevation and azimuth, making the gunner's task more difficult. When the aircraft had descended to just about the height of the sleeve target, he would reverse the turn and come on to the line of fire. He would aim the aircraft actually slightly ahead of the sleeve, so that by the time his bullets had travelled, the sleeve would have moved into the line of fire. Again, several things could go wrong, and the winch operator in the towing aircraft would have to be pretty wary to keep an eye on the attacking aircraft. If the attacking aircraft turned too far and got too far behind the sleeve, he might turn, as you're being shown by the dot, and fire on a line that would be getting close to the towing aircraft. So he'd be told to stop. In a perfect world, he'd be following something like the line I have shown you here, which would be quite safe for everybody. Yet again, the aircraft's bullets, and this would apply with front guns. A slight variation would be for the attacking aircraft to pull onto a parallel course with the towing aircraft, for its own air gunner to fire the Vickers gun from the back cockpit towards the sleeve. Again, more than one attacking aircraft, each one would have different coloured paint on the bullets, so that when the sleeve was returned to turn and dropped, the colour of the holes would tell who had hit it. Typically, for a front gun attack during the war, a fighter pilot would expect to get 10 rounds out of 100 into the sleeve. A good pilot might get an exceptional pilot would get a lot more. A mediocre or not so good pilot would only get 1 or 2. So those are the major types of chute explained. Next, please. This is, I thought I'd put up 771 Squadron's badge. The Bs derive from the idea that it was a very busy squadron. It was one of the largest in the Fleet Air Arm, a lot of aircraft carrying out a lot of diverse fleet requirements roles. So effectively, they were busy bees. The squadron continued in use, both as a fleet requirements and a training squadron, until 2016. Latterly, it was at Culdrose. It operated Sea Kings. It trained air crewmen and carried out a search and rescue role in the southwest approaches. But the last fleet requirements unit was 736 Squadron, also at Culdrose, which flew Hawk jet trainers, which carried out the classic role of simulating attacks on ships in the English Channel, carrying out their workup procedures. They continued until last year. So there are now no fleet requirements unit. The role has been taken over by simulation artificial intelligence and computer programs which feed into the ship's fire control systems. So nowadays, the fire control systems can be so realistic, even when they don't fire, that they provide everybody with the training that they need. So I've actually finished a couple of minutes early. I'm happy to take any questions now or develop on anything I've said. Next slide, please.
We've
So
had
are there any questions, please?
We've had a few questions come in, but I might start by asking one of my own, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
How were the FRU pilots selected, and how dangerous was the job of a pilot in the FRU?
Okay. Selection was by a number of ways. In 1939, the Admiralty was still striving to build up the Fleet Air Arm. It had been run as a joint force with the RAF between 1918 and 1937. In 1937, Sir Thomas Inskip, the Minister for Defence Coordination, agreed that it should be a wholly naval concern, which meant that the Navy had to replace the RAF pilots that had flown with the RAF. They did it in a number of ways. They started by taking people on short service commissions. They also asked for volunteers who had served with the Fleet Air Arm to come back in. And they also looked for people who had effectively private pilot's licenses or who had flown with airlines and asked them if they would like to come and do so. Some of the more mature people who volunteered had got flying experience, but not much operational experience. So they were offered jobs in fleet requirements units. So that was one source of people. Another source, not to put too fine a point on it, were people who hadn't done that well in flying training. And it was felt that rather than put them straight into fighters or torpedo bombers, their chances would be improved if they spent a year or two flying generally, and then they could go into fighters and so forth. So those were the two major ways of providing fleet requirements pilots. Later in the war, it became a way of resting people who had been in demanding frontline positions. So people who had been embarked in a carrier, might have been shot down, might have been wounded, could go into a fleet requirements unit and fly for 6 months or so before going back to the front line. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Was it dangerous? Inherently, there were dangers. Yes, the throw-off switch could be in the wrong position and someone could shoot at you. Yes, the engine could fail and you could come down in the sea. So there were casualties. There were also the dangers that some of the pilots became bored and took the opportunity to beat up things ashore and lost control of the aircraft and crashed. Not so many of them, but they did happen, so I mentioned them. So yes, there were dangers, but inherently it was a lot less dangerous than flying a frontline aircraft and carrier.
Was there any notable instances, maybe where the guillotine missed or targets were missed or anything like that that was recorded?
What that?
Any accidents or anything like that that might have been quite notable?
One notable one I know was a fleet requirements aircraft from Crail that decided to beat up a bus on a road to frighten it and crashed into it, and several people were killed. But I'd hate people to get the impression that was a commonplace incident. That was an unusual one. But there were dangers. That dangers were inherent in any form of flying in those days.
Of course. Are there still FRU squadrons today?
Nope, the last of them, the Interim 736 Squadron, it went 2 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Nowadays, computer simulation is so good that you've got the same people in, say, a destroyer, looking at their screens, doing everything on a keyboard that they would be doing to engage a target aircraft. You can even get up to the point where a round would be fired, but it isn't. But a training program on their screen would simulate it being fired. So the theory is anything can be done. Simulation is now so good that whereas in my day all your flying training was done in an actual aeroplane, now between a third and a half of all flying training is done in a simulator.
Wow.
Because it looks, feels, and does everything else exactly the same as flying the real aeroplane. And you can feed in all sorts of things going wrong so that pilot reaction is there to sort it out.
We've had a few questions coming in on YouTube, so I'll head over to there now. We've had one comment from Orkney BG who said PO Eric Haslam had to ditch in Ibster Loch while towing a 32-foot glider. We have a bit of on site. Eric was a distant cousin of mine.
Ah, right. I would imagine that around the Orkney waters, there are quite a few bits of 32-foot, 16-foot gliders and sleeve targets. If you wanted to get rid of something, it was damaged and tumbling, you would guillotine it into the sea in those days. So I'd imagine if somebody could use a laser to let the waters of Scapa Flow less opaque, you'd probably find quite a few on the seabed.
But Orkney BG has just revealed himself as Andy Hollenrake, so I
Ah,
don't know if that's an acquaintance of
my
yours.
regards to him.
Howie's also asked a question.
Mhm.
Today, the technology does so many things that pilots then had to do themselves. Are the core skills still the same, would you say?
Probably better because they enable you to do a wide range of things that you could never do in the real aeroplane. For instance, the Rock that you saw as a target towing aircraft was forbidden to be intentionally spun because spin recovery was by no means certain and was probably dangerous.
Mm.
The same applied to the Blackburn skewer and several other frontline types. With simulation, you can simulate a spin and the correct recovery to get out of it. So there are a lot of things you can do with simulation that you could never do with a real aeroplane. So
I
you,
imagine though it would be quite difficult to go from simulation to actually flying a real plane, even though you might have got the controls down. I guess the
no,
mental preparation, you would be totally prepared,
no,
do you think?
it's good. In today's aeroplane, take the F-35, before you fly a mission, you would fly it several times in the simulator.
Mm.
The fidelity is so high that you would hardly know. If you strapped in with all the kit and everything on,
Mm.
you would hardly know you were in a simulator. It's one of the, again, having trained the way I did in a real airplane, having subsequently flown a simulator, one of the things that struck me most in the Phantom simulator, supposing you did a wing over and then flew it into the ground to crash it, you would get all the feeling of the ground rushing up to meet you, and then the instructor would reset it. So you would appear to come backwards up from the ground back to the position where you lost control of the aircraft. Um, and it feels real. The early simulators, because the fidelity wasn't that great, you flew in a sort of twilight where you saw the lights of a city or the lights of a ship.
Mm.
Now you fly it in full daylight and you see whatever you see exactly the same way that you would for real.
Incredible. Really, it's great innovative technology.
And airline pilots spend most of their training. They gain a flying qualification on a light aircraft, but then all the flying they would do on a Boeing 777 would be simulation
Mm.
before going as a second pilot to a
Mm.
real airplane.
And we've got another question from Howie coming. It seems that decisions were made so quickly as compared with today. Did war concentrate people's minds, or did those earlier days of aviation bring in people who were naturally more decisive?
Gosh, that's a leading question.
Yes.
What, from the point of view of flying the aeroplane or from the point of view of defending against it?
I imagine from the point of view of flying an airplane, but I will see if another comment comes through.
Okay.
Mm. No comment as of yet. So maybe from
No,
the point of view
it's
from the
not an
pilot.
easy one to answer
Mm-hmm.
because people today are not the people of that I've been talking about 80 years ago.
Of course.
Um, some of them would have been as decisive, but with the background they had, the majority might not be, if that isn't too wishy-washy an answer.
Well, he says the whole overall process of getting things done seems to have been so much faster then.
Ah, I see what he means. Yes. Um, Interestingly enough, I've just read something on the US Navy's um, method of procuring new aircraft and systems. And it said the problem with the US Navy at the moment is it's locked into a procurement process that's geared at something that'll take 30 years to achieve.
Mm.
In the Second World War, you were looking at something that could improve the aeroplane you were flying in next month.
Wow.
And that's actually quite a big deal at the moment as we evolve into the use of unmanned air systems.
Mhm.
If you're actually fighting somebody, you don't give a damn what might be available in 10 years. You want something that can give you an edge next month, next
Yeah.
week, now. Um, that was pretty much the way some of the defensive systems that I was describing in ships changed dramatically during the middle years of the war. At the beginning of the war, for instance, the first ships fitted with radar, um, it was put to them. The battleship Rodney was one of the first 6 ships in the Royal Navy equipped with radar. It was described as being so secret that only a select handful of people must know um, what it was and what it could do. So the net result was you had an operator who arrived with the radar when it was installed, and a midshipman, was detailed off, inducted into the secret, and he had a notebook and pencil. And when they were in action, the radar operator would shout out a range and bearing, and the midshipman would write it down. And it wasn't until after the German airplane had flown over and dropped a bomb that anyone in the command team realized that what had been going on was the aircraft position, course, and speed had been reported to them for the last 20 minutes. It didn't occur to them to do anything about it. So, extreme example, it took a few days to realize what they'd got and what they could do with it. You don't just walk into saying, this is radar, this is what we'll do with it. You have to begin to think, wow, we could do this, that, and the other. Learn. So they were probably about as decisive as we are,
Mhm.
but took time to gather new technology.
Well, Howie says that's an excellent answer, so thank
Oh,
you.
thank you.
I'm now wondering what happened to the FRU aircraft after 1945?
Good question. Virtually all of them were scrapped.
Oh,
In Australia, a lot of them were American aircraft that had been provided under Lend-Lease.
mm,
And we were told by the Americans that we would either have to pay for them in dollars, which we didn't have, or um, to get rid of them to a third party who would pay for them in dollars, or destroy them, or ship them back to the United States, which would have cost us money and a lot of ships to put them in, or destroy them. So in the case of Australia, we took the line of destroying them. So about 1,000 aircraft were put on aircraft carriers, taken about 20 miles off the coast and pushed over the side into the water. Lovely chance to get a clock off the dashboard if you were quick enough with a screwdriver. And lovely stories about people sat in cockpits with screwdrivers frantically undoing things while the aircraft was pushed towards the edge of the deck.
okay.
Even here off Orkney, some aircraft were pushed into the sea. Conveniently, the Fleet Requirements Unit airfield in Malta, Hal Far, was on the sea with a cliff. So most of
Mm,
the aircraft were pushed off the cliff onto
wow.
the rocks below. Most of them were destroyed or flown to airfields that were going to be closed in the near future and then sold to scrap dealers.
What a shame.
Hmm.
Really is. Um, Another question is, were there FRU squadrons like 771 NAS in many other places?
All over the world.
Wow.
It was one of the Fleet Air Arm's largest tasks. So there would have been squadrons like 771 at Leon Solent in the south of the UK for ships in Portsmouth and Plymouth, Northern Ireland, Gibraltar, Malta, Tikela in Egypt,
Hmm.
Aden, Ceylon, India, um, Australia. There were, and even the Admiralty Islands north of Papua New Guinea. There was a fleet requirements unit.
That's
So yes,
wonderful. Yeah. Brilliant. Were operational squadrons ever used on FRU tasks?
yes and yes. If you had a disembarked squadron at Blot and you wanted to carry out a simulated strike on the fleet, you'd do it. You'd have to be quite careful how to brief them, though, because operational squadrons use their own operations, which is the way we would attack a German ship. To an extent, what you'd want a fleet requirements unit to do would be to attack the way a German aeroplane would attack a British ship, and that might not be the same.
Hmm.
Um, and today, even the Americans have what are called dissimilar combat squadrons that use a variety of aircraft, and they use um, Russian or Chinese tactics. They
Mhm.
don't use American tactics because there's not much point in training your own people. They know what they do. You want something that's going to strike them as different. So yes, they would have done, but not necessarily as easy as you might think.
Would it have been quite difficult to be able to capture German technique in flying back then, having no, surveillance like we do
No,
these days?
because it would be fed back. The
Mhm.
Admiralty had very good operational analysis units. So when a ship was attacked, it would come out with a report of proceedings saying it's very noticeable that the enemy did this, this, and this. On the 10th of January 1941, German Stuka dive bombers from Sicily attacked the British aircraft carrier Illustrious off Malta, and they completely wrong-footed the defence. They sent in a line of torpedo bombers, which brought all the defensive fighters down to the sea surface where the torpedo aircraft were. And then while they were down there, dive bombers came in from high level and dived vertically down onto the ship and hit it with bombs. So they were able to dissect what the Germans had done, and from that, the techniques they employed, and to produce counter techniques of our own.
Wow.
Very difficult to hit a target that's coming vertically downwards.
Yeah, definitely. Another question's come in again, about how many planes would there have been at Tern at the peak of activity?
Good question. It could have been, I mean, a lot is the short answer. Hundreds,
Yeah.
probably 250, something of that order. Um, thousands of, over 1,000. I think when it commissioned, there would have been something like 150 officers and something like 1,500 sailors
Mm.
at the place. And there was capacity for more aircraft than were permanently based there, so that frontline aircraft from carriers could disembark. So, say, working figure 250 on an average day, which is a lot of aircraft to control.
Yep. Another comment's come in from Bill. The onward decoys, Signat, and jammers have changed fighting so much.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
The onboard decoys, Signat, and jammers have changed fighting so much.
Yes. Um, Warfare, you get idea, counter idea, idea, counter idea. Um, Radar, brilliant to start with because it gives you a range and bearing of a target, but radars can be jammed. If
Mm.
you jam a radar, you're actually putting up a beacon saying, hello, I'm here. So you have another system that can home on the jammer and destroy him. Um, Decoys another good idea. You can deploy different sorts of decoys. You can flares, radar decoys, etc., which will seduce heat-seeking or radar-guided missiles. But you can also produce infrared-seeking missiles that can say, that's a jammer. I'm really going for things. So there's some specific features of a jet fighter exhaust which might not be the same as the jammer. So yes, constant thing. There's never going to be the perfect answer that you will always defeat a missile with a jammer or a decoy, but it's constantly evolving. And there's something else where a development process that takes years is useless, because if somebody comes up with a weapon that can defeat your jammer, you want to do something about it now, not tomorrow.
Finally, I've got one more question. You mentioned a bit about Bismarck earlier. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the role of the FRU in passing on information about the ship.
Right. Foul weather, RAF Coastal Command said they couldn't fly. Captain of Hatston at that stage said he had got aircraft that were perfectly capable of flying there. So a Maryland was prepared, flew off. They didn't have any observers in 771. They only had pilots and telegraphist air gunners who acted as winch operators. So it took off with a scratch crew of 4. Pilot, I know, was Goddard. Observer was Commander Hank Rotherham, about to be promoted captain, and 2 egg tags. Regrettably, I can't remember the names off the top of the head. Flew out into the North Sea. Weather was reasonable to start with, got worse and worse and worse, so they got lower and lower and lower. In the Maryland, it had a big glass nose that the observer sat in. Pilot was behind him, behind a bulkhead, and the 2 air gunners were further aft, one of whom manned the radio inside the fuselage, and one of whom had a gun on top of the fuselage. When they got down to about 50 feet in torrential rain under black cloud, Rotherham, who must have been quite excited, sat in a greenhouse with the water whizzing by under his boots, decided that they weren't going to get much further like that. The best thing would be to climb up into the cloud and then every 20 minutes or so let down to see what the wind was doing at the bottom. It was vital that they knew what the wind was, because they navigated by drawing a pencil line on a chart and aiming off for the effect the wind would have on their aircraft. So to make a perfect landfall off Bergen, which they needed to do, he needed to constantly update the wind direction and speed. So they came down continually throughout the rest of the sortie, worked out the wind, made a perfect landfall just south of Bergen, which is what he wanted, so that he knew he had to turn left. Turned left, flew into Bergen Fjord, flew into all the subfjords, and found that Bismarck had gone. Came out, and he wanted the information to get back as quickly as possible, but the German anti-aircraft fire hit and damaged the aircraft, and the intercom failed. It also probably wasn't helped by the torrential rain, which would have made the wiring wet. So Rotherham wrote on a piece of paper, send urgent to Home Fleet, Bismarck has sailed, screwed out the piece of paper and shoved it through a bullet hole to the pilot, who took the piece of paper and passed it to the telegraphist. They had been briefed that there was a common reconnaissance radio frequency over the North Sea that, in theory, both the RAF and the Fleet Air Arm used to send information about enemy ships. And that was what they were briefed to send it on. However, it was manned by the RAF, and because Coastal Command wasn't flying, they'd shut down. So there was no reconnaissance frequency manned on that day. So the telegraphist kept trying to send it, didn't get a reply on his radio. So he used his initiative and retuned the radio to the frequency that was used by 771 Squadron to tow banners for ships to shoot at. So he managed to tune into that and immediately heard people saying, right, I'm running in now to shoot, and all the sort of everyday non-operational things about working with ships. And he came up and said, flash, 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 which is the thing for I have an operational signal of immediate importance, clear this radio frequency. So it's sending it by Morse, and he sent flash, flash, flash. This is aircraft Tango 8 Kilo or whatever it was. Bismarck has sailed. Repeat, Bismarck sailed. Bergen empty. And so the message got to the CNC Home Fleet. They landed on Rotherham. Was taken immediately to the captain of Hatstone, described everything he'd seen. But by then, the CNC Home Fleet in King George V had weighed anchor and sailed and was on his way out to intercept Bismarck in the Atlantic. So it was quite an exciting event, lots of initiative. I know they flew low over a German gun position, and one of the tags used his gun to fire at it to suppress the enemy fire. And the two aircrew, I think Rotherham got a DSO, the pilot got a DSC, the gunner who fired, no, it was the gunner on the radio, got a Distinguished Service Medal. The other tag didn't get one, which I think is rather a shame, but there you go. So it was an exciting thing. For a second line squadron, it was a big deal.
Yeah, that's
That's
incredible.
one of the reasons why 771 was one of the last fleet requirement units to go. The number was famous.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It was very interesting and insightful, all about FRU. And thank you, everybody watching online as well on YouTube. We've had some great comments coming in.
I hope when people see the tower and things at Tern, it'll make them think this is the sort of thing that went on there.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, David, for joining us as well today. It's been
Thank you, Kat. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
That is the end of our Aviation Online talk so far. We may have one again in October, but hopefully we will see you there soon. If not, we have an in-person event tonight in Kirkwall at King Street Hall, so please stop by and join in for that. And we will have some recordings coming in live later on the YouTube channel. But again, thank you so much for joining us today on this talk, and thanks again to David. Goodbye, everyone.